So tonight, I'm delighted to welcome into our virtual studio two Birmingham-based artists, Mohammed and Amerah Saleh, as they talk to Dr Nadia Khan. Nadia is a palliative care consultant at John Taylor Hospice in Birmingham. She believes that facing death and loss with the right support can open doors to connection, meaning, and growth. She works with a team who are passionate about improving the experience of people, families, and communities from all walks of life who have non-curable illness. So I'll hand you over now to Nadia, who will introduce her guests.
Afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome, and I'm so pleased to be here with you today as part of this conversation with two local and inspirational artists as we explore this question: how can spirituality and creativity help us navigate death and loss, which, as Anna has said, is part of the online programme for Brahmyodo's A Matter of Life and Death Festival this year. Now, Anna didn't know this before she approached me to be part of this conversation, but I've also been exploring and connecting with my own creative capacity through writing and poetry over the past year. On a personal level, I think as part of connecting with my own faith, but it's also been very much woven into making sense of loss and death on all its different levels, really, in a year of COVID. So this is why I'm really looking forward to hearing from and speaking with our two guests today, and the reflections and insights that they bring from their own positions as creative artists, for whom, you know, faith and spirituality holds meaning and reflects in their work. So just to give you a brief look at what to expect, our two guests today will spend about 10 minutes each sharing some of their thoughts and work on the question more broadly. And then we will roughly have half an hour's conversation with questions that just delve into the topic a bit more deeply, followed by 15 minutes where questions posed by yourselves as the audience are answered. We're going to finish this session tonight slightly earlier at 8:14, as we're in the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, and our two guests will both be opening their fast at sunset. So at that point, Anna will join us again, where we will share reflections on the discussion and answer any questions that we can. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two guests tonight. So Amerah Saleh is a spoken word artist whose Yemeni Muslim roots give her space to get lost and found on multiple occasions between identity. She's the co-founder of Verve Poetry Press. She's a board member at Apples and Snakes and a general manager of Beat Freaks. Amerah has performed all around Europe and recently released her first collection called I Am Not From Here, which I've been very kindly gifted by Anna. So I've got my copy here. Her work touches on identity, womanhood, religion, and the obscure idea of belonging only to one place. Our second guest today is Mohammed, who is a pioneer in the street art movement, and in 2008 established Soul City Arts, where he works strategically to bring art to the lives of everyday people. He's also an educator and curator, a trustee at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, and associate artist for the Birmingham Repertory Theatre. He's created art for live audiences throughout the world and been awarded an MBE in 2016 for his service to art and community cohesion. So thank you so much both for joining us today. And as part of an introduction to your work, I'd really like to start off, if I can, by asking both yourselves to share a bit about how faith and spirituality has inspired you as artists, and what that means for how you've engaged with the experience of loss and death. And it would be great as if part of that you could share some of your own work, so that myself and the audience can get a feel of it. So I'll open that to Amerah first, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and a topic that is has been explored in my work for many years. I'm a spoken word artist. I originally started writing in theatre, and the cliche of accidentally falling into spoken word really did happen by a YouTube exploration. I have been writing about death and dying, I think, from a year after my first real loss, which was my 1-year-old nephew. and I was about 14 when I lost him and 15 when I started writing. So for me, when I was really reflecting back and preparing for today, I think actually my writing is very in synergy with everything that's happened in my life from about 15, which is when around the time I lost my first nephew. And since then, writing poetry for me, I've done the go to therapy, I've done the spend a lot of time alone with God, and I've done all of this in terms of to heal. And there is an element absolutely where all of that works, but there was really an element where writing for me was that healing and was that ability, particularly I think for a 1-year-old, when we didn't know that he was going to pass away. And I think it was a chance for me to say what I didn't say, and also a chance for me to have him in writing and close to me. And since then, a lot of the writing that I've been doing explores identity and belonging. And as part of that belonging, a big thing for me is the world, like belonging here and how long you belong here for, and this whole idea with my religion of, it's momentarily in our lifetime that we're here on earth. So it's a very big exploration, but I'm actually not a huge talker and I'm more of a performer. So I wanted to read a couple of things from my grief section of my book. So this poem is called The 31st of October, 2017. I was always taught not to cry, to shush, to be quiet, to not cause a heavy heart with tears. I have 28 years of dirty water living inside of me. I now know why a human being is 65% water. It's our tears, being told to hide away. It's our parents telling us to grow up. Our teachers telling us to stop crying so they can understand us. Our culture saying tears hurt the dead. I'm going to cry into prayer mats until they start to mildew, in hope that I can make up for lost time. My next poem is called Graveyards. My body is flat, still as a fresh body in a morgue. My mind is stood up, a soldier, a tower block, an amputated arm urging up into a fist. Snakes under the ground have made me God-fearing. The soil is comforting me, my blanket is full of sin. The sin of smoking, the sin of hoping, the sin of love. I'm a God-fearing walking sin covered in a culture that I can't explain. I have been running towards God whilst my body is flat, still a morgue. And my last poem is called Amerah, which is my grandmother's name, who passed away whilst I was in Bratislava, actually. I sat on the right-hand corner of your inflatable bed. The air is slowly being released without me realizing. I hold your hand in a crowded room of faces I spent years erasing, like rubbing out pen marks with a blue rubber. Your hands used to have potential to be Nivea model-like. Now they're dry, like you've given up on the chance for people to love you. I lean to your cold but queen-like face and call out, Nan, it's me, Amerah. Your breaths inside my head say you know. I'm stood in a room, hood up. I'm 8 again, and you are teaching me to hold my balance on 6-wheel rollerblades. I'm 7 again, and you're sneaking us into your room to give us mint or orange club bars without our parents finding out. I'm 6 again, and you are standing outside our school gates with sweets. I'm 5 again, and we are feeding the ducks every Saturday in Cannon Hill Park. I'm 24, and sat beside you with my lips to your forehead, trying to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amerah. That's really powerful. And I'm sure the audience are going to let that kind of sort of embed in and think about that. Thank you. So I'll move on to Mohammed Ali, if that's okay. Mohammed, same question to yourself. And maybe if you could touch on how your faith has helped you experience and navigate loss and death, and how that comes across for you in your art.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. So, I mean, similar to what Amerah mentioned, being of the Islamic faith, being Muslim, is something that really, I would say, has completely been the main factor of why death for me is part of, I always describe it as being part of our daily reality. When one when one prays on a prayer mat, and as Muslims, and I try to, I've been trying to establish the 5 daily prayers for a few decades now, since my 20s. You're reminded while you're on the prayer mat 5 times a day of death. Death is part of your daily reality. So this is something that growing up, being taught to pray as a young child, being born in a Muslim family, being the son of immigrants to this country, whilst I was born here, I think that has given me and provided from a young age a complete insight, a complete kind of an alternative perspective, if you like. I always say that when you've washed bodies that you've lost count of, right? When you've shrouded them and buried them and put soil into the ground and been a part of that, of both people who are close to me as well as people who are not, community members, I've completely lost count of how many people I put in the ground, right? And that's not to say that I know lots of people who've died, not really at all, but rather the reality within this community of how death is part of a kind of everyday reality, and how actually your duty and responsibility of caring for the dead, caring for the sick, visiting the sick, being by the side of those who are on their deathbed. And again, whether it's close family or not, whether it's people who in the community perhaps that you might not be too familiar with, but still the community duty to be present and care for the sick and the needy. So as I said, that's being part of growing up in society, really. Whilst I might be British born, Birmingham born, young lad, just like anyone else, I think that kind of that background and that foundation of being a Muslim, whilst not particularly observant Muslim, but up until much later in life, until I was a young adult, but being born and raised with it, not particularly understanding it. As I said, I think my first funeral I remember attending my uncle's when I was about 7 years old. So from that young age, it was still around you. Death was still part of that reality. You were always taught that in the family. So it was only, it was kind of, what's the word? A logical thing, logical progression, really, that my art and the creativity that I express was informed by this, I wouldn't say informed by death, but death always seems to kind of weave itself in there somehow or other, whether it's indirectly talking about valuing life. When we're talking about valuing life, it's because we're aware of death. So in a way, all of our work and everything we do is about being aware of death. So simple things and beautiful things. So it's not always doom and gloom, but as I said, the beauty, when we reflect on beauty, is because we're aware of the idea of death that kind of lingers behind that. So I suppose I'll dive into sharing a video of something that's more recent, because as I mentioned, I've experienced death quite, I'd say relatives, uncles, aunts, and buried many in the community, washed a body many a time. But it was within my direct family, I lost my father about 12 years ago, which was the first time where I really felt like a member of my household is now absent from my life, that I've always lived. And more recently, actually, I lost my mother to COVID back in, 3 months ago now, in January. So that now, having lost both parents, I'd say, death has become, even more such a thing that it's so at the forefront of my life right now. I myself have come close to it recently, about a year ago. due to some ill health problems, but you know, I'm okay now, thank God. But as I said, death has come knocking my door too many a time, to the point where I'm now, it's like I'm actively engaged with trying to address how we as a community and how we as society must engage with death in a very real sense. You know, this isn't no fantasy. This isn't no, you know, bedtime story, fantasy stories that we scare children with. Death is real, and it's there, and it's something that it's inescapable from every single. That's one thing that's promised, isn't it? Every single person is going to experience it. Nobody can escape it. We can escape many things, but not death, right? So, as grim as that sounds, and I say that with a smile on my face, because you know something. As I said, I kind of treat it a little bit like, you know, we just got to confront it. We just got to deal with it. You know, let's get over it a little bit. So as I mentioned, my mum only a few months passed away, and it came through, and I responded in a project I was delivering, and it's called the Same Boat. I'm about to play the film, and it was a performance that was delivered in a beautiful church actually called St. Wolfram's Church in Lincolnshire. But I think I can play it. And then I can give some context to it afterwards if you wanted to unpick it further. But it's a collaboration between myself and one of my favorite vocalists, musicians called Cleveland Watkins, and it was a short film that was played. The actual whole performance was supposed to be with a live audience in this beautiful church, but actually COVID struck, and then we had to delay it. And we were looking for the right moment, and it never happened. That moment never came, and in the end, we made a short film for an online audience, and this is that short film that I'm about to play. So just to share with you that the project was inspired by, partly inspired by the words of a poet, Damien Barr, where he speaks of the same boat and actually, are we in the same boat or rather the same storm? And it was kind of interpreting that a little bit. And you may have seen variations of that actually, where people have said, we're not in the same boat. You know, some of us are in rubber dinghies, some of us are drowning, right? And it's kind of actually blowing away the myth that we're actually in the same boat, and rather actually the inequality that certainly in COVID-19 has highlighted, something that we knew was always there, but certainly COVID has thrown the spotlight on the inequality that exists and the lies that we are told that we are all actually in the same boat together. So that artwork was kind of capturing the spirit of these words of this lie that we kind of told about being in the same boat, and actually setting the relevance of it being in the church. Saint Wolfram, who was a patron saint of the danger of the sea, and who the church is where he's buried there. So it was kind of a nod to Saint Wolfram and the reference to the sea. But then a year into COVID, we started off kind of talking about the sea and the dangers of sea, and then it kind of morphed into this. It felt like it had a new meaning now when we referenced the boat and that we're all supposed to be in. So over to you, Nadia. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, that's really amazing. I think when I think of loss and experience, the grief that's been experienced in this year, we've really seen different faith communities and interfaith work come together in practical ways around food banks and, you know, supporting people who haven't got that structure around them and communities around them. But we've also seen these really kind of beautiful expressions of shared truths, really, and that shared experience of suffering and loss. Even though obviously it's looking different for different people in different communities, but there's something very unifying. It's that common experience, isn't it? And you know, it's been really, really, really amazing to see some of the work that's been done around that. I'm curious to know from you both, really, taking a slightly wider angle on it, what your thoughts are around creativity within the Islamic and religious tradition, really. How important do you think it has been to help people navigate death and loss, and do you think it will be going forward? Sort of part of my experience, or part of the exploration that I've done, has led me to read some really amazing death poetry by different kind of scholars in the past, and you know, people who've actually tried to explore the experience of dying or disintegration really from a religious perspective. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that at all. Amerah, do you want to go first?
I think from my perspective, I've always seen the Quran as a really long poem, and the way it's beautifully wrapped in metaphors and imagery is for me where I think the connection for my faith and my poetry is. Like, I've always been intrigued by, oh, that's really interesting. And I always talk about, you know, the big one, an eye for an eye, which is taken out of context so much, rather than seen as in context of the piece that it's in. So in my writing, the connection between me being a Muslim and then me being a poet is the foundation of who I am as an artist. I always get told, like, I can't write. Every other poem has got something about me being a Muslim, or it's got references to the Quran, or it's got, because that is who I am. And I feel like with death and dying, like, you know, there are, and it happens less and less now, but, you know, when we were younger, there'd be like, you'd sit in a circle and sing songs and remember, and all of that creativity element around death and what we do to grieve, I think is very beautiful, because Islam has many different pockets of cultures. And the beautiful thing is everybody then deals with it, not just individually, but then culturally, everybody does it a bit different. And the way, you know, you can sit in a room and sing songs with a djembe you can harmonize together, and that is the remembrance of the people who you've lost is very beautiful. Do we see it as a creative outlet? Absolutely not. We just see it as part of the grieving process. So yeah, I think to answer your question, I think it's embedded.
Yeah, no, I think it for me, it takes me back to that understanding that creativity is, for Muslims in the Muslim tradition, it's a divine attribute of God. You know, it's a name of God, Al-Khaliq, Al-Bari, Al-Musawwir. All of these aspects really are, you know, they're very divine. They're divine in their origin, and our creativity as creation is just a reflection of that, really. So, and I think creation and thinking about reflecting on God's creativity in the world around us. Again, there's so much focus and emphasis on that in the Quran, as you've said. So, you know, the creation of the heavens and the earth, the miracle of life and death, and thinking about reflecting on death and disintegration, and it all being part of the work of God, really, that creative power and that energy. So yeah, that really resonates. Any thoughts from you, Mohammed, about that creativity and how that kind of works within the Islamic tradition for you?
No, I think you've said it all. Not much else to add to that. Both of you.
Thank you. Okay, so the second question we've got for Amerah then is just a reflection about your poetry, really, and maybe you could enlighten us with a bit of commentary or some context. Reading through some of your poems that you've written, there seems for me to be this common running theme of separation and fragmentation, and you talk about it in the introduction to yourself as well, about sort of making and remaking your own identity, and there's also this sense of compartmentalizing as well, of emotions and feelings, and that really resonated with me. I think it kind of reflects in your title of the collection as well, I'm Not From Here, but also its physical layout and the way that you've sectioned off the poems as well. So can you give a bit more insight into that, where you're at as an artist or a poet? Do you feel that is a massive theme for you, or a massive part of the experience in your journey so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a big thing for me in my writing is it's grown up with me, and the more, you know, I'm looking after my mental health, the more my poetry matures in elements. And when I published the book in 2018, and really, apart from commissions, I haven't really written anything for myself since, and I haven't pressured myself to. And in a big thing for me is when I need an outlet in my writing, which is I've lost someone, I've lost a part of me. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person. I'm grieving over a part of me internally. I tend to turn to writing. So a big part of the last 2 years, although has been a lot of grief in an element, I've almost tasked myself with kind of communicating with myself before I go and put it into writing. And the plan, everything changes, but the plan is to sit down at some point when I can be back out in the world and go away for a week and try and digest the last 3 years, it would be, from since my book came out. The idea that in terms of writing is belonging and identity runs for me, being British, so born in the UK, but being Yemeni, and then going to live in Yemen when I was 10. So completely having this, and it explores it in my book, but having this utter culture shock of how people lived in Yemen, and then being forced to come back for family circumstance, having to come back because we were meant to live there for the rest of our life, having to come back to the UK and then being like, oh, so now I am British, has always been for me the battle that I have. So now I feel like I live in the UK, but I'm Yemeni. Like there is nothing apart from me speaking English and me paying my taxes. There's nothing British about me, because I was able to go and be in Yemen and connect with my family. It was also where I first discovered, which explores in my book, that my mom was adopted. She was an orphan at 7. So the element of, although for me, the direct experience, as Mohammed was saying, was when my nephew passed away at 1 in 2005, death and grief has been a constant conversation in my family. It's exactly what Mohammed was saying, is we really talk about it like it's an event that we're going to go to. It's not something we shy away from. Is it because we've experienced it so much, or is it because it's religious? I don't know, because I've never not experienced it. But it has always been something that my mom has talked about very openly, and it makes sense because she'd lost her parents at 7. So yeah, that was a bit of a tangent, but
that's really, really interesting. Yeah. And sort of touching on that, I guess, sometimes it feels as if we don't really talk about death and dying very openly, and specifically sort of death being a taboo within the Muslim community. Sometimes that idea gets sort of understood to be the case. Sometimes what I found is in my professional role, some Muslim families can struggle with the idea of talking about death and dying, or planning for the future in the cases where death is a likely event to be happening. How do you feel as artists engaging within your local communities? How do you think, or how much of a taboo is death, do you think? And are those taboos different across different generations? Mohammed, I don't know if you've got any.
Well, I don't. I mean, I can imagine from your perspective, you deal with a lot of families, and it's your interpretations that, from your experiences, that it's a taboo for many. I wouldn't have thought so at all, actually, based on what we've just shared. That actually, because it's part of our lived reality, and death is ingrained within the faith, and it's so, as I said, you pray 5 times a day, and in the verses they're reciting, we're asking, in your supplication 5 times a day, you're referencing death, right? So I don't know if it is a taboo. I would always say, I think that it's kind of it's something that we do tackle from young to old. In fact, parents are always kind of reminding the children, like I said, my mom would, when she was alive, it was something she'd say regularly, when I'm gone, how are you guys going to cope, or what are you going to do? And it's just become something part of our, daily conversation of dealing with death, talking about death. And actually, when with peers, perhaps at school or college growing up, you'd find actually there's, it was a very different approach outside of the Muslim community, where people would be almost like, well, we've never thought about that. We've never spoken about death. Whereas you're talking about, death in a very kind of real sense. So amongst your peers who perhaps were not from the faith, from Islamic faith, you realize that, guys, we're on different pages here, because we kind of talk about death in a very much more open and very, in a completely different way. So I would say, yeah, death is, I'm certainly, I do, the idea of it being a taboo, I say this to all, I think this is a problem in society, that death is the biggest taboo in life. And that's a problem, right? Because this thing that it's inescapable. Why the hell are we not talking about it more, is the question I always ask into all communities, right? And I think that's a disaster, because, like you said, when people don't confront it, when people don't kind of have it as part in the forefront of their minds, not just when they're about to die or they're about to lose somebody, but it's kind of embedded within you, then you're gonna lock up, you're gonna fall apart, yeah. And that's what I don't want to turn into kind of preacher mode here, but for me, my faith is, I'm thankful the fact that I'm 2-3 months after the passing of my mother, You know, within days, I was doing sessions like this, right? Talking to a camera of the loss of my mother to COVID. I was completely like, you know, it was fresh, and it was all kinds of emotions I was feeling, including anger at the government, which I won't even open that can of worms and go down that road of how much, you know, I blame the government. Absolutely, I do. I blame the fact that the 125,000 plus deaths are on the, you know, the blood of that is on the government, right? But at the same time, you know, as I said, it was through my faith that I was able to remain balanced and composed and actually accept, you know, the fact that, you know, this was inevitable and it was meant to be. So this taboo, this idea of death remaining a taboo, and it's not something that we kind of engage with until we're sick or it's really kind of becoming a reality. I think that really needs to be smashed apart, and death must be part of our reality. And I'd encourage anybody, you know, as grim as it sounds, to be kind of approaching death and talking about death, whether you're young or old. You know, we always hear people talk about it and say, oh, you know what, you got to be prepared. You can go anytime. I've always heard that you could go anytime. Young person, you could fall under a bus and you could die, right? And it's a bit of an abstract concept, because you still think, well, there's more likelihood that I will stay alive and I'll die when I'm 65 or 70, 75. But you know what? It really is the truth that you could die. I nearly did die a year ago, right? And I'm not 65, right? I won't tell you how old I am. But so that I honestly, that's really the kind of the forefront of everything I'm about now after what I've experienced, because I like to kind of, you know, share my experience, if you like, not preach, but share the thing I've been through, the awful thing I've been through, as a way that might hopefully open up people's minds a little bit to the reality that the reset button that has just been, that we've all experienced this with COVID-19, in a way, it was necessary in a way. It's a necessary kind of jolting of our lives, if you like, our kind of necessary glitch that was needed in society, if you like, a wake-up call. But I tell you what would be a disaster is if that we do go back to what we might call normal. I mean, I think that would be a disaster if we don't and I always say this, I've been saying this recently, that if we do go back to normal, then you know what? My mother's and the many hundreds of thousands of people who have died, their deaths would have been in vain if we don't wake up and let this be a kind of a moment for us to reflect and change our approach in life.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think without saying too much, and I want to hear what Amerah's thoughts on it is, I think some of the conversations that we have about death, they might just look or feel quite different as well. So the paradigms or the ways that we think about talking about death and dying in different communities feels different, and people have different ways of communicating and what's important when it comes to talking about death. So for some people actually, and within the Muslim community, what I find is that things that we're interested in as professionals, you know, such as advanced care planning and thinking about preferred place of death, for example, where would you like to be, what sort of treatments would you like to have, not like to have, that's not necessarily the important conversation about death and dying. And so it can feel like that element is a taboo, but it's not really. It's actually what's meaningful for that community or that family or that person, and focusing on that. So I think sometimes, like I said, I think it's the conversation which is different in different communities. So but I agree, my own experience has been sort of death filters into a lot of conversations, just the flyaway comments, the sort of, you know, the context to life, the context to different experiences, you know, all of that stuff. So I would agree with Mohammed. You know, I saw death very early on in my life. You know, the first time I remember seeing death up close and personal was as a 6-7-year-old when I went to a janazah, a funeral prayer for a community uncle, and seeing the face in the coffin, you know. So if for us, we grew up very much sort of not having that barrier between life and death as an experience. But Amerah, would you like to share your thoughts, especially maybe coming from a slightly younger generation? I like to say slightly younger than me, but you're probably a lot younger than me. So do you feel that there's any difference there you know, thinking about death as a taboo?
I think that there, like Mohammed said, I don't think death is a taboo as it is going to happen and everybody is going to experience it. And I think we talk about that. I think there are almost mini taboos within it. So, for example, children is a very big one, of like, children shouldn't die is a very big thing. Although I find from my personal experience, when I speak to my non-Muslim friends about miscarriages and the way Muslims grieve it, almost it's a very natural process of life. And some of my other friends make it is a ceremony, and it is a child, is not something I've experienced directly. But actually, when a child is born, and what you were talking about in terms of like end of life care plans and stuff like that, I've been involved for them for my nephews, and where we're going to take him. He's going to be in a hospice and all of these things, and not just once, but 4 or 5 times. And it's one of those things that it's not easier. For example, I never say like my nephew passing is easier than my grandma, because he hasn't lived life. But my grandma passing wasn't easier because she's lived a good life. It's a very different kind of grief. But I think a big thing in the taboo is the preparation from an Islamic perspective. Is like when it happens, I think it's a very natural in what we do, and the spiritual element that we have around it in the preparation. I find anyway, from my experience, is it's a bit more of a taboo to kind of sit there. And I think, for example, like I know but I know when I want to go. I know what I want to do. I know all of this, and my mom finds it very, very weird and consistently tells me it's haram to say that. Don't say that. And there's an element where I completely understand, but I think almost that creating an end of life plan from an older generation perspective is like, don't predict any of that. It happens when it happens, and it happens on the time of God. So in that mentality, I think I'm a little bit more open in terms of going, well, I've had to be naturally, because I do a lot of the work with my sister around my nephews. But in terms of going, no, this makes sense of why we do it and how we do it. But it's not something that comes culturally, naturally to the older generation in my family.
And do you think that there's something around sort of that expression of autonomy, the fact that you can own that experience, being able to talk about it in a way that doesn't necessarily resonate for, different generations in the community, being slightly younger? Does that feel like that's a thing, or not particularly?
Yeah, I think there's a big thing around. Obviously, we can't, and a big thing Islamically is you can't predict, you can't predict death or how it will happen. But for me, there are things that you can put into place. So like my family find it really weird that I have a will and I have a life insurance and I have all of this stuff. And that culturally is because none of my family, my elders, have had to do that in life. So for me, it's taking that autonomy and control of, I know when I pass, this is a step-by-step that I want to happen with my house and with things. And, rather than just going, oh, culturally, it just hands down to the people in the family and it just goes like that. Like I have a process. And some of my family do go, oh, you're a bit too Western. Like, let's do it the cultural way. But preparation is okay. I'm not sitting there going, at this point I want to go. I have a vague age where ideally I would, but I don't have a set of this is how I want to go, because I can't predict that. That is in Allah's hands. But what I can do is prepare so that when I am gone, the right things are in place for me.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question just about really what your experience has been as artists and being community members, living through the COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously being from communities of ethnic minority, we've experienced loss, grief, death, partly from migrating, the traumatic experiences which have led to migration to the UK as a community. But over the last year, again, COVID-19 has led to another raft of significant experiences of loss and grief, just because of the way that the pandemic has specifically hit certain communities. Can you share your observations on how the local communities have reacted to that? And what has that meant for you as artists in those spaces? And does it feel different, or is it different to what it was like pre-COVID? So Mohammed, I don't know if you want to take that question first.
Yeah, so if you could just simplify your question a little bit, what are you saying here?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how your local community has reacted to undergoing the grief and death experience from the pandemic, knowing that actually as a community, I understand you're from a Bengali community, that community has already experienced trauma through the migration from the partition and from the war, 1971 war, coming over to the UK. So there's a lot of like inbuilt memory of trauma and grief for a lot of different ethnic minority communities. And how does it feel that, the communities reacted to the pandemic in light of that?
Sure. I mean, I would say, I can't speak for all ethnic communities, but I would say the trauma of migration is not something I personally can relate to, and even my family, to be honest with you, because I think it would be an assumption to make that. I think minorities that experience migration have all experienced trauma of death because they were from war-torn countries, etc. Not at all, in fact. So I'd say, certainly from my experience, as I said, being born and raised in this society, pre-COVID, as I said, the only experience of death was more so. And my own family, in fact, even my parents, when, as migrants, our only experience of death was we were focused on, like most families really, just focused on getting on with life here in the city of Birmingham and making a living. Certainly, I think COVID, however, I think was I think when it was a realization that it was certain, diverse communities, South Asian communities that were affected in such numbers, I think that was a big, I think it was a kind of big scare and a big wake up call for many in the community, including myself. We were extremely cautious for an entire year, and we did our best to try to be as safe as possible. But even that wasn't really. Was not, as I said, was not good enough, really. We did our best, but as I said, I mean, you kind of think, I mean, if I'm honest, before you experience it yourself, I mean, I'm talking more so kind of the COVID experience here now. You'd see the statistics on the TV, and you'd hear about even us, watching the TV, and you'd hear about the Bangladeshi community who were affected massively, where my parents were from, and you just see, it's just stuff you see behind the screen, right? You see onto the television, and like a lot of things, when you see bombs going off on the other side of the world, it's horrifying, but it's still, you kind of gloss over it, right? Because it's just something behind the screen, become desensitized to it. Similarly, I think when you see these statistics and these numbers that were being reported, and even hearing about your community that was being affected so much, it was only until you actually realized and you had people literally dropping off around you. As I said, I sat with my mother watching the TV, looking at these statistics. So and when one of you becomes a statistic, or one of yours becomes a statistic, that and that sent waves amongst the community, because if soon enough everybody knew somebody who was dropping off, right? I mean, I could count up to 10 people that I know have lost, that have been, and that's unprecedented, that have gone from this pandemic, both people who are close, both people who are distant relatives, friends. And I'd say, how many people outside of these communities can say that they know people? I mean, I think I was speaking to one of the Brom Yodo team, and they were saying that, you know, many of us don't know anybody, and, you know, and I suppose we kind of take it for granted. For us, we're kind of like, well, we know loads of people in the community. There's so many have gone, right? I've attended, you know, a number of funerals. So the point is, I think what I'm saying is that the reality of COVID in this community has been a massive, massive wake-up call, and this is something that there's a lot of trauma, a lot of issues that need to be dealt with, and it's going to be a lot of work here in dealing with this.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, there's not much more I can say, really.
I think the enormity of that is, like you said, it's huge. And I think as a palliative care doctor, I'm starting to think about that in terms of how do we start to have those conversations, or how does the conversation shift for families now and people now that they've experienced trauma in their communities on that level? What does it mean for that conversation? How open people are to talking about death and dying, and you know, confronting those questions. Amerah, I don't know if you've got any insights from being from the Yemeni community, because obviously the Yemeni community has been through a lot recently as well in terms of grief and trauma and loss from the experiences of what's been going on in Yemen. Do you have any thoughts on that at all? Do you think that impacts, or, you know, has affected how people have dealt with the pandemic?
Yeah, and I can't speak on behalf of the whole Yemeni community, but I found the opposite. I find that a lot of the Yemeni community are so okay with death and dying that they're just like, well, if COVID happens, COVID happens. And that might be directly linked to what's going on in Yemen. Like, I've personally lost more family members in the last year to the war than I have to COVID. And so it might, I don't know if it's personally connected, but the idea that, you know, like my dad is a shielding person and my nephew's a shielding person, and it was me that really had to cement everything. Otherwise, if it was up to my dad, he'd be out and about every day, and, you know, and not because he needed that freedom, because he's in a wheelchair, he needed to get out and he needed to see his friends and needed to see people. But we'd enforce that. Otherwise, for him, he was like, well, yeah, it doesn't matter. Like, if it's my time, it's my time. And there's a very, very Yemeni saying, is just like, when it's my waqt, it's my waqt. Like, it's fine. Which, yeah, so I think I've had probably the opposite experience in terms of, which frustrates me on a completely different level, because I'm going like, you know, there are people that are dying, like, just because you don't know anyone directly, people are. But we find it's a big clash between trying to explain that to the family.
Yeah, that's really, no, it's really interesting how it's just landed so differently as an experience for everyone. So we're coming up to nearly 8 o'clock, so it might be a good time to start to answer some of the great questions we're getting in the chat from the audience. So I'll start off with a question which is focusing back on your art, really. So does art offer the chance to create new metaphors and vocabulary around death that may allow or aid conversation to happen? So I don't know, Mohammed, do you want to go with that first?
Hang on. So does art offer a chance to create new metaphors? Yeah, I think so. I think I think when we speak about death, I mean, I say this as someone who's practiced with primarily as a graffiti artist and coming from being inspired by hip hop culture, and art that was much more accessible, if you like, as opposed to art hanging in fancy galleries. And I'd say that talking about metaphors, vocabulary, and exploring death, when death is often seen, I suppose, through the prism of faith and religion, and actually, you know, sacred books and certain language that is very, what's the word, you know, you kind of a certain, you know, almost like quite, I'm trying to think of the word, I need a poet to help me here. But whatever the word is about kind of very, you know, seen in a very formal kind of language, quite, you know, it's quite scary and serious and whatever, right? Those are bad words, by the way. I'm sure Amerah's got a thesaurus that can help me with the better word to describe it. But you know what I mean? Like that kind of religious speak, seeing it through this kind of, you know, Bible bashing, kind of Quran bashing type of approach, as opposed to kind of talking about death in a much more real sense, in a sense that is accessible for young people and everyday people of modern society, of this age that we're living in. And that's kind of what I like to do, whether I'm talking about death, which I do a lot of, where I'm talking to young children or people in society about the reality of death on a much more lived experience level, but using language and vocabulary and as is it, and I can't remember, that's the question, Andy, I think it was, about, you know, how using art to help do that. So as I said, through street art, that's kind of what I do, you know, when I'm using, you know, street art is about breaking art down into an accessible form and letting it spill out onto the streets. So I say that kind of my own craft is about kind of breaking things down in a much more kind of easier to comprehend way, if you like. So I suppose this, yes, absolutely, to the question about that art can break down death as from a taboo into something that is much more accessible.
Yeah, metaphors and language, Amerah will probably tell us more, but it's just continually evolving and changing with society, isn't it? The way that language reflects society, but also how, you know, the community creates language as well to talk about important things. So, Amerah, was there anything you wanted to add to what Mohammed said?
Just really quickly, like Mohammed hit the nail on the head, and I think one of the big things that I find, and as an example of Mohammed's work actually, is like when Muhammad Ali died, and Mohammed, you went around and you put these beautiful pieces of artwork. That is a way of you know, talking about grief, and you know, young people talk about them to me to this day, and that's not something that, you know, a newsreader or a journalist could have ever got across to a young person. And I'm talking more from a younger generation especially. But what is art? Art is stories. And the better way to, if you were telling stories through our artistic practice, it is better than, you know, reading some jargon off a piece of paper to a camera.
Fantastic, thank you. So another great question. So does using the word death in poetry help us to use it in the real world rather than depending on euphemism? So does using the word death in poetry help us to use it in the real world rather than depending on euphemism?
I think I would say death in the poetry sense is death of anything. So where we're talking here about like a human life, in poetry form, death and grieving is used in a sense of self, and in a sense of a part of you or an age of you, or so it's used much more metaphorically and what that means. But again, going back to that, creating the language and the stories to be able to talk about death through poetry is going to allow, if I read a poem about, you know, my nan passing, I'm going to connect more than just standing there saying, you know, my nan's passing. It gives an emotion, and it gives a person behind it.
Okay, thank you. A question for Mohammed. Do you think that your art might help help people who have not personally experienced death open up conversations about death and dying?
Might help people who have not personally experienced death. I hope so. Yeah. In short answer, basically, I hope so. That's kind of what I try to do. I'm committed to doing now. I was doing this anyway beforehand, but more so now, after my mum's passing, I'm completely about turning what was a calamity for us into a blessing, because if people can be informed through this tragedy that was befallen upon us, then I'm happy, and I'm delighted, in fact, really, that that's something that can be turned from a calamity into a blessing. You know, so more than ever now, I'd say my art is really about kind of is in front of, because the reality is, if we talk about death more, life is better, right? Simple as. And that's what we should all be striving for, right? Why do we need to focus about death? That's why I've engaged so much with you guys at Brum Yoda. I've done another session with you because I really believe in the work that you guys are doing, and the work that many of this network and these networks are doing, which is artists and medics and palliative care folks kind of coming together to explore this crazy thing called death, right? And how do we make it something that is kind of more accessible and, you know, and comprehensible and approachable. So I'm definitely focused on doing that now. Yeah.
Thank you. And we've got another question for Amerah. Amerah, do you find that people of your own generation are more able to talk about and plan for death?
Yeah, in short, I think, and there was another question around COVID, and I think a big thing is COVID, particularly for younger generations, and, you know, being able to see it and to see it on a mass scale. I think there is a privilege in living in the UK where we do see a lot of the things on screen that are happening in other parts of the world that we're not necessarily. However, COVID it didn't matter where you were, and actually, you know, the UK is worse than Yemen in terms of COVID cases. But so yeah, those things where I might have said no, it's probably just about the same about a year and a half ago. I think it absolutely has allowed people to, especially younger people, to have those conversations.
Thank you. We've got a question for Mohammed. I'm conscious of time, so I'm keeping a track on that as well. It's a question for Mohammed. Could you tell us about any further plans you have creatively about your mum's passing? Any other plans for artistic work or expression? I think you're on mute, Mohammed. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of planning a mural. I'm painting on a double-story building in Sparkbrook, actually, and it's actually the street that I was born and raised on. So it's a total blessing that this wall has become available right on the street, literally a few doors away from where we used to live back in the the 70s and 80s. So I'm planning this mural, and it actually happens to be. It's funny how we got the wall. I won't go into the full story, but I'd hand painted my mum's little stone for my mum in Kings Norton Cemetery. Is you have a temporary one that you put in first before the stone comes. So I'd hand painted it, and I put a lot of time and effort into it. And then there's alongside there these other temporary stones, and I took the number off one of them to call them about getting a permanent stone. You do that after a few months once the ground has settled. And I called them up, and it happened to be a funeral parlor, a funeral service in Sparkbrook, and it was actually on that road where I lived, which I never knew it was there. And when I called them, I was like, I turned out I know the guy, and he said, "The building's yours. Come and paint it." So it was funny. It's funny how that kind of worked out. So yeah, a funeral service in Sparkbrook that I rang up by chance, and then it turned out that they've offered me their wall now and said, "Come and paint something." And I hope that mural would be a bit of a, again, people will see that on a daily basis. I'm going to be approaching it carefully, because what I don't want is something that's going to be this kind of terrifying thing that's going to traumatize people. But how can it be a beautiful reminder for people? So it reminds people about death in a beautiful way is what I'm hoping to do. through this mural.
Just on a purely personal level, what sort of time frame are you looking at for doing?
Looking at that in the next day, it's getting warmer now, which always helps. You know, I've been waiting for the weather to get better. I'd say we're going to plan that in. We're in April now, end of May, I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah, sometime.
We'll definitely be looking out for that.
Yeah.
Fantastic, amazing. So another question we have, a question for both of yourselves. Do you ever feel like your creativity is somehow a legacy to defy death? Do you want to go with that, Amerah, first?
Yeah. To defy death is throwing me off. I definitely feel like I'm saying it when I published my book, is like, this is for life. This is beyond me. It's going to be here. And a big part of my writing, and particularly in the Yemeni community, before, you know, people could even read and write, the way we shared was through stories. So I've just turned it into more of a permanent thing, which is making sure that it's written down and printed out into something called available online now. But to be able to have that beyond you, and to hear the stories not just of me, but of those ultimately around me, which is my community, after I'm gone.
Thank you. And Mohammed, any thoughts for you?
Yeah, I'll just comment about, you know, legacy, because legacy is really, for me, it's my thing. You know, as a trustee of Birmingham Museum and working around a lot with archives. I mean, archives, you know, I'm always banging on about it to communities to say, you know what, archive everything. You know, be a hoarder. You know, being a hoarder is seen as a negative thing. Hoard every damn thing you got, because one day, in 100 years' time, someone's going to reflect, and you will need to tell the story of who you are. When I talk regularly into, as our parents did when they first migrated, you know, they would record into the old-fashioned thing called a cassette, right? Where they record into a cassette and send those tapes back to their families abroad, because that was a way of, you know, kind of, and those cassettes and that kind of capturing that moment in time. I mean, now we have these devices in our phones to just be able to record onto the phones, onto SD cards, not just sitting in phones, because phones always break. And you're like, oh my God, I lost the pictures. I lost this. I lost that. I try and advise people all the time that get your video footage off your phones. Do not ever leave. And so many people don't do that, right? You're not thinking about legacy. You're not thinking about telling our story of now through these pictures and videos and sound bites that we have in our phones and WhatsApp notes. Put them up somewhere and actually have them so that they can be sitting there for your great-grandchildren to know about this extraordinary time that you lived in.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I think we're probably coming towards the opening of the fast. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking out the time today and really sharing a lot of insight and bringing in that really complex interaction between how creativity helps us understand death and dying, and it's so rich and so complex and so unique, and lots of food for thought being shared this afternoon. So thank you so much. Is there any final words that you'd like to say before you go? Okay, thank you very much both. Hope to see you soon.